stress. So mindfulness can be really helpful, or go for a walk, or writing concerns down in a diary. We give people sort of a big toolbox to apply what works for them, but we also look at compensatory strategies to help with attention and memory. So whether that's using your phone to be able to write notes to yourself.
So I put a timer on my watch if I was running the bus. You're so clogged up with chaotic thoughts in your head that you don't even think to do simple things like that.
And then we also look at rehabilitatory strategies, so things that we know challenge the brain to improve cognition over a longer period of time. Learning a new instrument or learning a language, and the more engaged you are, the more likely that you'll be able to attend to it, which will help with attention, and memorize it to be able to help improve, hopefully, the symptoms of cancer-related cognitive impairment. We've had so many patients who, with the feedback from the course, it's just feeling that they're not going, in their turn, sort of mad or depressed.
Well, it's helped me massively. I mean, I don't think I could have started off a new business and everything with my brain, have better brain function, so I'm incredibly grateful for it.
Huge thanks to Natalie Hall for sharing her personal experiences, as well as to Tamsin Longley and Sarah Stapleton at the Royal Marsden Hospital. And thank you for listening. I hope you managed to stay safe and cool if the extreme heat is heading your way.
Inside Health was presented by James Gallagher. The producer was Beth Eastwood. The Royal tonight's at 10 o'clock. Let's speak now to Anna Holligan to find out what's coming up. Evening, Anna.
Thanks, Ron. The Conservative leadership race is hotting up. 6 contestants have made it through to the first ballot. We'll be looking at who they are and what they represent for the party and the country. We hear from a former Somaliland representative to the UK who believes Sir Mo Farah's revelations about his childhood could help other victims of child trafficking. And we'll take you to Capitol Hill for the latest on the January 6 hearings and speak to a British filmmaker about his rare behind-the-scenes access to the former President Donald Trump and his children before, during and after the insurrection. That's all coming up in half an hour.
Anna, thank you very much. And going back to that Conservative leadership contest now on Radio 4, Jonathan Friedland and his guests consider historical parallels to the events we've been witnessing at Westminster.
The Conservative Party pushes out a charismatic, dominant Prime Minister mired in scandal, and now faces the task of finding a replacement from a crop of ambitious rivals, all of them jockeying for position and power. That's the picture now, following last week's resignation of Boris Johnson after some of the most dramatic days ever witnessed in Westminster, and with nominations open as we speak to find his successor. But the Tories have been here before, and in today's Long View, we'll be looking at 2 key moments: removing a Prime Minister and replacing him. The first of them exactly 100 years ago. Lots of talk about the backbench 1922 committee, of course, which just yesterday announced the way it plans to run the current leadership election. And it's the events of that year that we're going to talk about first, with Laura Beers, Professor of History at the American University in Washington, D.C. Laura Beers, we're talking about 1922. Just tell us, sketch out for us what the political landscape looked like back then.
Britain in 1922 had coalition government. They'd been in coalition since 1916, a coalition brought on by the First World War and headed for the previous 6 years by David Lloyd George, who was a liberal. He was the architect of the liberal welfare state reforms of the early 20th century, but he led a coalition dominated by Tory MPs. In fact, the Conservatives within the coalition, there were a large enough number of Conservatives to form an independent majority government if they so chose, which was crucial to the events of October 1922. Because Lloyd George had been in power at this point for 6 years, he was a forceful personality within British politics, with a large personal following, with charisma, with political wile, and he wanted to call a general election and have another coalition election.
As a personality, what kind of leader, what kind of Prime Minister was David Lloyd George?
He was a doer. He was an innovator. He was someone who was always full of ideas about how to reform the state, how to do things more effectively. He didn't have very much respect for party, right? And he was Prime Minister of a coalition government for 6 years. He effectively threw his own party under the bus in order to maintain his leadership of the coalition.
And a very colourful figure, and the Prime Minister still in post in our country, known as colourful, known as a big personality, Boris Johnson, but also plagued by scandal. How much does that description map onto David Lloyd George?
Particularly by the time that we get to this moment in the autumn of 1922. Lloyd George is increasingly plagued by scandal. He's had what's known as the Marconi crisis. Marconi was an early manufacturer of wireless radio sets, and he was implicated in, ultimately cleared from, some dodgy dealings in terms of buying stock and selling at the opportune moment in Marconi because of insider information. He was implicated also in a cash for honors crisis in which he was selling peerages to enhance his personal election coffers. But the event that brought Lloyd George down was a policy crisis, which is a distinction right to today. It was to do with events in Asia Minor. The Tannic crisis, as it was known, was a debate about whether or not Britain should allow itself to potentially get roped into a conflict in Asia Minor with the newly independent Turkish state. Many within the Conservative Party and more broadly within the British Empire did not want to risk committing troops to a conflict with Turkey and saw Lloyd George and his colleague Winston Churchill within the cabinet as overly belligerent and potentially pushing Britain to a break of war.
So as you say, that's a policy difference. But in terms of his personal life, I mean, colourful, it kind of almost under-describes it. Just tell us a little bit about what he had going on there.
So he was colourful, you're right, underestimates it. Lloyd George was effectively a bigamist. He had a long-standing marriage to his wife Margaret, but then an almost equally long-standing marriage to his secretary, Francis Stevenson. He was someone beyond the relationship with Stevenson who was known to have had many affairs. So very much a someone whose moral fiber, in terms of his personal life was questionable, but whose moral fiber in terms of his political life was in the eyes of many equally suspect. He was an opportunist. He would throw any of his colleagues under the bus if it would keep him in power, or at least that was how he was perceived by many.
I mean, that description about moral fiber, both personally and in terms of his conduct of public office, there would be plenty of Conservatives who were saying the same things about Boris Johnson over the Partygate affair, and then over how much he knew about his Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher. Right now, there was a fear that partly led to the ejection of Boris Johnson, that was somehow rubbing off on the Conservative Party and damaging the perceived integrity of the Conservative Party. What about back then? What fears did Conservatives have about being led by this figure of David Lloyd George?
Both one of the key similarities, but also the key differences between 1922 and 2022 is the extent to which policy was really central to the disagreements that Conservatives had with Lloyd George. The Liberals had long been associated with free trade, whereas members of the Conservative Party, including Stanley Baldwin, who really helped to instigate the coup that brings down Lloyd George, wanted to institute tariffs, what they referred to as imperial protection. So there was a sense that Lloyd George in and of himself was a bad person to be leading the state, but there was also equally a sense that he was stopping the Conservative Party from pursuing the type of economic policies to which many were deeply committed.
So much for then his critics. What was his base within the party? With Boris Johnson, he could always rely until right at the very end on the Brexiters. They were his bedrock support. Who performed the equivalent function for David Lloyd George?
Ironically, the Lloyd George issue splits one of the big political families of the early 20th century. So the two half-brothers, Austen Chamberlain and Neville Chamberlain, who famously leads Britain during the period of appeasement in the late 1930s, were very much divided on Lloyd George's value to the state. Neville Chamberlain's older brother, Austen, who had served in various positions during the wartime coalition government and remains head of the Conservative Party and a member of Lloyd George's cabinet, is an ardent supporter of the coalition and of Lloyd George's premier. Thinks that the best way forward for the Conservative Party is to remain closely aligned to Lloyd George going into the next general election. So
there's this dissent against the Prime Minister. There are supporters of him, of course, too. How do things come to a head?
So a meeting is called of Conservative MPs only at the Carlton Club.
And it's at the Carlton Club. We have to chip in here because, of course, the Carlton Club played a crucial role in the events that eventually brought down Boris Johnson, because it was at the Carlton Club that Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher, was accused of sexually inappropriate conduct. Right there, the same scene. But this time in 1922, a rather different event.
Yes. And there's a meeting called in October 1922. And Austen Chamberlain goes into this meeting. He knows he has many opponents on the backbenches who want out of the coalition. But he goes in and he says he thinks that the best way forward for the party is to go into the next general election under a national coalition banner, allied to Lloyd George. On the other side is the senior party figure and longtime coalition cabinet minister, Andrew Bonar Law, who, by throwing his weight behind the opposition to Lloyd George, really helps to swing the debate. He's one of the most senior statesmen to make the anti-Lloyd George case. Largely, it's discontent on the backbenches that helps to bring Lloyd George down. Junior ministers and up-and-coming men within the government, such as Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain.
And as you say, one of the speakers in that heated meeting in the Carlton Club is a rising star by the name of Stanley Baldwin. He makes a speech which has earned its place in history, and here to read an extract from it is David Hounslow.
The Prime Minister was described this morning in the Times, in the words of a distinguished aristocrat, as a live wire. He was described to me and others in more stately language by the Lord Chancellor as a dynamic force. I accept those words. He is a dynamic force, and it is from that very fact that our troubles, in our opinion, arise. A dynamic force is a terrible thing. It may crush you, but it is not necessarily right.
The words of Stanley Baldwin, that description of David Lloyd George as a dynamic force. Again, Boris Johnson's critics didn't deny that he was a powerful, larger-than-life political figure, but they too worried that it was a destructive force rather than a positive one for the Conservative Party. When Baldwin made that speech, how great was its impact?
Well, I think it's seen as swaying many people who already were moving in that direction. But Baldwin sort of sums up that feeling and gives it what becomes immortal catchphrase, this term, Lloyd George is a dynamic force, and that this is a bad thing. And with that is able to kind of provide an easy rationale, a kind of succinct summary of the opposition to Lloyd George's continued leadership from many on the backbenches. And the ultimate vote to lead the coalition gives a majority of over 100 MPs. So it's 187 to 87 in favor of leading the coalition.
And so that removes, in effect, Lloyd George as Prime Minister. Who is chosen to lead the Conservatives and take over as Prime Minister as a result?
So this is where Bonar Law, the senior statesman, steps in effectively as a caretaker prime minister after the Conservatives withdraw their support from Lloyd George and form their own government going into the general election.
He made a lot of headlines just last week, the way Boris Johnson took his removal. How did Lloyd George take being ejected like this?
And his view was kind of to give this up, but also Lloyd George, in his mind, I'm sure believed he would be back, but he never held office again.
And what about the Conservatives themselves who've made this gambit? Did it work out for them?
It does. They win victory in 1922. They then, perhaps unwisely, call another general election in 1923 to try to get a mandate for a tariff policy, which doesn't work out as well for them and leads to the formation of the first Labour government in the United Kingdom. But they're back in power by the end of 24 and in power for most of the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars. So things break well for the Conservative Party, and particularly for the junior minister, the president of the Board of Trade in 1922, Stanley Baldwin, who served either as prime minister or as a number two throughout most of the interwar period.
So Sajid Javid, whose resignation triggered the slew of resignations that eventually defenestrated Boris Johnson, may take some comfort from the Stanley Baldwin story, that it does sometimes pay off. One last thing we have to ask you. The 1922 committee, they're making the weather and running this election to find Boris Johnson's successor now. What exactly is the link that committee that exists today has with the events of 1922 that you've been describing for us?
So the 1922 committee, as it's currently known, is only formed officially in 1923, and it's formed as a forum for backlash MPs, MPs not in the government, to have a voice within the party. Ostensibly, it's not named in honor of this coup in October 1922, but this is clearly from its inception, on everyone's mind, is a moment where backbenchers really flexed their muscle and made their voice heard.
Laura Beers at the American University in Washington, thanks so much. We're taking the long view of when Conservatives remove and replace a sitting Prime Minister. We've talked about the removal of David Lloyd George in 1922. Time to fast forward to the replacement of a Prime Minister in 1963. And here to tell us about that is Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London, who's written extensively on the history of the Conservative Party. Tim Bale, the incumbent back then is Harold Macmillan. There's a vacancy in 1963. How does it come about?
Well, Harold Macmillan has been Prime Minister since January 1957. He's won a big election victory in 1959, since when things have begun to go badly for him. The economy is not really firing as well as it used to. He is facing a fresh opposition leader in Harold Wilson, and of course he is in trouble because of the Profumo affair.
The Profumo affair became a byword for sex scandal. In a nutshell, Tim Bale, what was the Profumo affair?
Well, it was revealed that Jack Profumo, who was the Secretary of State for War, had been sharing a mistress with a Soviet diplomat who some people thought was a spy. And this created a huge scandal, which Harold Wilson, the Labour Party leader, made a great deal of play with.
And after a report on the Profumo affair had been published, Harold Macmillan came on the BBC, spoke to the BBC's Hardiman Scott in late September 1963, and we can hear that now.
Might not, in fact, this be another occasion for the outbreak of the leadership controversy all over again?
Well, the leadership controversy has nothing to do with the Profumo report. It starts as natural after in a position of this political position as to what is the best way of our winning the next election. And I've said over and over again, I'll tell you again, when I come to make my decision, I shall have only one thing in mind: what is best for the country and for the Conservative Party. It will have nothing to do with Profumo, which doesn't seem to be relevant to it at all.
Listening to that, Tim Bale, you can imagine why, you can understand why people at the time were saying about Harold Macmillan he was just getting too tired for the job.
Yes, he was very tired, and not only that, he was facing a very difficult medical situation. He had a very painful prostate problem, and he believed that prostate problem was in fact much more serious than it turned out to be. So when he decided that it was time to go, it was partly because he was due to undergo an operation and really thought he just couldn't carry on any longer.
So a combination of health, political weariness, some of those scandals lead to that decision to resign, but the timing is so important. When did this resignation take place in terms of the political timetable?
Yes, it was an absolute bombshell because it was delivered to the Conservative Party conference, which was meeting in Blackpool, via a letter read out by the Foreign Secretary who sat in the House of Lords, Alec Douglas-Home.
And this moves us to the focus of our conversation, which is the business of replacing a Prime Minister. Now, of course, the Conservative Party have those rules detailed by the 1922 committee just yesterday about how many nominations each MP must have to make it onto the ballot, exactly the timetable, and so on. But what about back then, Tim Bale? What were the rules then?
Well, the rules were, there were no rules. The Conservative Party leadership was not decided by election. It was decided by a rather opaque method of soundings being taken in the Conservative Party, and in particular in the Cabinet.
There's quite a contrast with the situation now. We've had the 1922 committee issue its rule book, as you like, its timetable with percentages and numbers of MPs needed to nominate, all really laid out. But then it was this much more sort of, it sounds like smoke-filled rooms is essentially the process.
Yes, essentially it was all behind closed doors, and of course, therefore, subject, some people say, to manipulation by those involved in the process.
So give us the runners and riders. These days, the big names people are talking about, Nadhim Zahawi, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss. Who were the big names in the frame back then in 1963?
Well, there were three very obvious runners and riders. The first was the Deputy Prime Minister, Rab Butler, who had been around a long time, was seen as a very competent manager, and actually was very popular with the public. He was certainly the bookies' favourite, and the favourite of many of the newspapers. Then there was the Chancellor, Reggie Mortling, very clever, but universally known as a little bit lazy, a little bit louche. And then there was Lord Hailsham, Quentin Hogg, who was Lord President of the Council and leader of the House of Lords.
So it happens at Blackpool, and what part does that play? The fact that there's a party conference going on, how do these three candidates campaign?
Well, the conference gives them a chance to set out their stalls, and in particular, Rab Butler and Reggie Maudling have big speeches to make. Rab Butler's is in fact instead of Macmillan, because Macmillan can't attend the conference because of illness, but both of them blow it. Both of them deliver reasonable speeches on paper, but their delivery leaves an awful lot to be desired, making people think that perhaps their preferred candidate wasn't really the man for the job. Quentin Hogg doesn't make such a mess in terms of a speech from the podium, but what he does is immediately goes into campaign mode, so much so that it was all seen as a little bit off by Conservative MPs and Conservative commentators. He even at one stage brought his baby down into the conference as a way of sort of showing he was a family man. And I think there was still quite a lot of antipathy to American campaigning methods in the Conservative Party and indeed parties in general, and that's just seen as a little bit too much for people.
There's a little echo there, isn't there, with this highly polished video that Rishi Sunak put out right at the start of the campaign, where some people thought it was just a bit too slick, perhaps a bit too American in its technique. But for Quentin Hogg even to be on the ballot, he had to make a move.
Yes, he did. He announced that he would be announcing his peerage, and that was possible because some legislation had recently been passed to allow members of the House of Lords to do that in order to become MPs. Tony Benn on the Labour side being involved in that. So yes, it didn't necessarily rule him out that he was in the Lords, but he would have to step down from there and just be known in future as Quentin Hogg.
So the Conservative Party then, Tim Bale, was in a bit of a pickle, I suppose, because you'd had this slightly tepid performances from two potential frontrunners in Butler and Maudling, and Lord Hailsham has put people's backs up with this slightly too slick campaign mode. How does the party then, and the senior figures in the party, how do they react to this?
Well, they're very worried. I think Harold Macmillan would naturally have favoured Lord Hailsham, Quentin Hogg, but I think he felt rather let down by him at that point, so was beginning to think about another possible replacement. They, I guess, were beginning to wonder, was there someone else who could hold the party together and produce a rather more convincing performance? And they were given some indication of that by Lord Hume when he spoke to the conference on foreign affairs, and his speech was very, very well received.
And so this is somebody they hadn't yet thought of. He wasn't even part of the sort of initial field of three, but they think he could be viable. But he's got some obstacles to overcome.
Yes, Hume has got some obstacles. First of all, clearly he is in the House of Lords, and so he will have to renounce as well if he is to become an MP. He has previously said that he's not actually interested in the leadership, so he will have to go back on that. And it's also generally thought that he, while being very competent and being very pleasant, isn't necessarily, if you like, the sharpest knife in the drawer.
But there's also a younger generation of political figures in the party, who have their own demands of the leadership.
Absolutely. Many Conservative MPs feel that the party desperately needs to modernise its image, and therefore really don't want someone who sits in the House of Lords, is no spring chicken. They would rather go with a younger candidate, Reggie Maudling being the obvious example. And we're talking here about people like Ian MacLeod, Enoch Powell as well.
And Ian MacLeod, we have to mention him because he uses a phrase that it has been revived even now, as people are wondering if there could be some sort of senior voices in the Conservative Party who could sort out the party's leadership problems during the last days of Boris Johnson. This was talked about a lot. What is it that Ian MacLeod says, and what phenomenon is he describing?
Ian MacLeod retrospectively talks about this process of soundings to get a leader to emerge from the Conservative ranks as the magic circle. And by that, he really means that it is a kind of stitch-up by the old guard of the party, the elite of the party, trying to prevent someone with a more modern outlook coming to power.
But Alec Douglas Hume then emerges out of this sort of smoke-filled room process as the favoured candidate. What does the opposition then, under another political rising star, Harold Wilson, what does it make of the way that this new figure has emerged and becomes Prime Minister?
Well, it absolutely rubs its hands. Harold Wilson is very much pitching himself as a moderniser, both of the party and of the country. So for the Conservative Party to appoint someone who Wilson regularly refers to as the 14th Earl of Hume is an absolute gift as far as he is concerned.
There is that last hurdle that stands between Douglas Hume and Downing Street, and that is the fact that he has to get into the House of Commons. It's one thing to renounce your title. How does he do that?
He does that via a by-election which takes place in November. So we have a very strange situation at one point where the Prime Minister is neither a member of the Lords nor indeed of the House of Commons. But that doesn't last very long. He wins his by-election fairly easily and becomes an MP.
And we have the newly minted Alec Douglas Hume, the peerage having been dropped, the speech he gave on winning the by-election in Kinross and West Perthshire in November 1963 that enabled him to take a seat in the House of Commons as he became Prime Minister.
And lastly to say that now I'm Member of Parliament for Kinross and West Perth, and proud and delighted to be so, that it will be my duty to represent all the people of the constituency of any party or none. Thank you all very much.
Not for very long, says the heckler, about Douglas Hume's election to Parliament. But what about how long does he stay, actually, as Prime Minister?
Well, almost exactly a year, because in October 1964, he loses the general election to Harold Wilson's Labour Party, albeit actually by only a very narrow majority. So he turned out not to be as disastrous a Prime Minister in electoral terms for the Conservative Party as many of the young modernisers had feared.
But the legacy of this selection process, by which a new Prime Minister emerges through this very opaque method, a magic circle in Ian MacLeod's enduring phrase, How long does that last, Tim Bale?
It doesn't last beyond this particular contest. Alec Douglas Hume has to agree to change the process, and from 1965 onwards, the Conservative Party elects its leaders.
And that would change the face of the party. That wasn't just a procedural thing. That actually would have a real political impact.
Yes, the thinking was that were Conservative MPs invited to elect one of their fellow members, and given that they were concerned about the modern image of the party, they would probably move away from public school educated, aristocratic, or at least upper class figures towards more meritocratic politicians. And that was certainly true in the case of Edward Heath and in the case, of course, of Margaret Thatcher. And you can argue so on until, of course, David Cameron, an old Etonian, won the leadership in 2005. And, of course, Boris Johnson, too, went to that particular school.
And now all up for grabs. No one knows the schooling or identity of the next Conservative leader and Prime Minister. Tim Bale and earlier Laura Beers, thank you both for taking the long view.
The Long View was presented by Jonathan Friedland and the producer was Sam Peach. And you can hear more editions on BBC Sounds. Time now for a look at the weather, and overnight, Northern Ireland and much of Scotland can expect a fresh night with clear spells. Northwestern Scotland will see a few showers. Wales and Northern England will see clearing skies through the night, but the south will remain cloudy and very warm. Tomorrow, much of the UK will be fine and dry. The southeast will again turn quite hot through the afternoon. Northern Ireland and Scotland will see patchy cloud at times, and the far north will see a few light showers. Looking ahead, Wales and much of England can expect largely settled conditions to continue through the week, with spells of warm sunshine at times. Northern Ireland and much of Scotland will see a mix of sunshine and showers on Thursday, and some areas of rain through Friday morning. And that's the forecast. This is BBC Radio 4 on 92 to 95 FM, 198 longwave, on digital radio, and on BBC Sounds.
Hello and good evening. It's 10 o'clock. Welcome to The World Tonight. I'm Anna Holligan. A day of slogans and promises.
It's time for a clean start.
The truth will set us free. We can be better.
8 candidates remain in the competition to become the next Prime Minister after the former Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, pulled out of the contest at the last minute. The committee investigating the storming of the US Capitol last year has accused Donald Trump of inciting far-right extremists in an effort to cling to power. We speak with a documentary maker who followed Donald Trump's failed attempt to be re-elected.
What matters to them is the brand, the name Trump. And at all costs, they will defend and will fight to keep that brand alive. And the idea of defeat and brand just don't work together.
And could Mo Farah's remarkable revelations about his childhood help to lift others out of modern slavery?
We all are proud of him, but what about all those children that no one knows them and no one's proud of them and have to deal with their situation on their own? At least Mo is not on his own.
That's all coming up for you after the BBC News. Read tonight by Neil Nunes.
8 candidates are left in the race to become the next Prime Minister after nominations closed for the Conservative leadership contest. The former Health Secretary Sajid Javid pulled out of the race at the last minute. More now from our political correspondent Ione Wells.
The candidates vying for votes from their Conservative Party colleagues in the first round of voting tomorrow are Kemi Badenoch, Suella Braverman, Jeremy Hunt, Penny Mordaunt, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, Tom Tugendhat and Nadine Zahawi. They will each need at least 30 votes to get through to the next round. Tonight they all took part in huffings, trying to convince MPs to back them in the race. The candidates crowded into a hot, sweaty room in Parliament, arriving to the sound of fists banging on tables to make their pitch to colleagues. Neither the former Health Secretary Sajid Javid, who withdrew from the contest, or the Home Secretary Priti Patel, who decided not to stand, have said who they will support instead.
An independent inquiry has found that more than 1,000 girls were abused after obvious evidence of child sex crimes in the Shropshire town of Telford was ignored for decades. The inquiry has criticised shocking failures by West Mercia Police and the local council, as our Midlands correspondent Phil Mackey reports.
The inquiry was set up 3 years ago after several criminal prosecutions brought the problems to light. The chairman, Tom Crowther QC, heard evidence from dozens of survivors of abuse. He said that the authorities had ignored obvious signs of child exploitation, had blamed the children and not the perpetrators, and in many cases wouldn't investigate cases because of nervousness about race. One survivor told the BBC that agencies were now more willing to investigate, but that there was still a long way to go. The inquiry has made 47 recommendations, including setting up a joint team to deal with child sexual exploitation in Telford, which it said should report annually.
The committee investigating the storming of the US Capitol in January last year has accused Donald Trump of inciting far-right extremists in a last-ditch bid to remain in office. The president's inner circle have told how Mr. Trump ignored their advice to concede and instead summoned a mob to Washington. Our correspondent Namia Iqbal reports from Capitol Hill.
One of the significant witnesses today is Pat Cipollone, Donald Trump's former White House counsel. In pre-recorded testimony, he said he wanted Mr. Trump to concede the election, but Trump's informal advisors were pushing baseless claims of election fraud, leading to huge shouting matches in the White House. A day after that meeting, which was described as unhinged, Donald Trump tweeted to his supporters to come protest on January the 6th, saying, "Be there, we'll be wild." The committee says this was the siren call to extremist groups such as Oath Keepers and Proud Boys to turn up that day. 2 members of the groups are already awaiting trial on seditious conspiracy charges.
The former head of Britain's armed forces has said he expects a thorough investigation after the BBC found evidence that the SAS executed detainees and murdered unarmed people in Afghanistan. Lord Richards was chief of the defence staff at the time. Richard Bilton from the BBC's Panorama programme reports.
In Afghanistan, special forces were on kill or capture raids looking for the Taliban bomb makers who were killing British soldiers. Panorama has been told the SAS night raids became kill missions. British military insiders say they saw detainees being executed. Panorama identified 54 suspicious killings by a single SAS unit in one 6-month period. General Sir David Richards was head of the entire armed forces during the time we investigated. In a statement he said, "Given the compelling nature of the programme, if I was still Chief of the Defence Staff, I would order a thorough investigation of the events portrayed." The Ministry of Defence says extensive investigations have already been conducted into allegations about UK forces in Afghanistan and that no charges were brought due to insufficient evidence.
The UN Security Council has voted to allow aid to continue to be delivered from Turkey to millions of people in northwest Syria for another 6 months. Some members wanted a year-long extension, but Russia vetoed it. Sir Mo Farah says he's hugely relieved that the Home Office will take no action after he revealed in a documentary that he was trafficked illegally into the UK at the age of 9. The 4-time Olympic champion says he was illegally flown from East Africa to London and forced to work as a domestic servant. Speaking to the BBC today, Sir Mo said it had been difficult to admit his real past.
As a kid, often I try and think about that moment where I made a decision for myself, where I used to lock myself in my bathroom, and you cry every day. Cry every day and tell him, "Please someone get me out of here." No one comes to you. So you learn to lock that up. So I told myself, I'm not going to get emotional. I'm going to lock that up inside and just carry on living myself. It was hard for me to admit what had happened.
The first full series of colour photos from the world's most powerful space telescope show a section of the universe with galaxies containing millions of stars. NASA's James Webb Telescope captured the blue and orange of a planetary nebula called the Southern Ring, which is made of the gas and dust from a dying star. The telescope's project operations scientist, Shane Rigby, described one of the images.
It's teeming with galaxies, and that has been true for every image we've gotten with Webb. Everywhere we look, there's galaxies everywhere. And so what we're seeing is not just all the galaxies, but there's a cluster here. And so the cluster are all these white, kind of ethereal galaxies. We're seeing them as they looked back in time, right? The speed of light is only so fast. And so as we're seeing distant galaxies out in space, we're seeing them as they looked billions of years ago.
Jane Rigby.
Thank you, Neil. You're listening to The World Tonight with Anna Holligan.
We know that trust in our politics is collapsing. We're facing a cost of living crisis at home and threats abroad. We need seriousness and integrity back in our government. It's time for a clean start.
The truth will set us free. The problems run deep, and I'm in no doubt about the scale of the challenge any new Prime Minister will have to deal with. The right has lost its confidence and courage.
What I think people know me as is someone who is a patriot, someone who knows how to unleash the incredible potential that we have as a country, but someone who will always be straight about the trade-offs that we have to get there.
Our leadership has to change. It needs to become a little less about the leader and a lot more about the ship.
There's only one thing that can turn Britain around, and that's the British people themselves, if only the government will allow them to do it.
To win the next election, we need to deliver, and deliver for the British people. I know that our country's best days lie ahead. I'm a candidate with a clear vision for the future, who can drive change and get things done.
This is my vision of Britain, and a vision people across the United Kingdom can buy into now and in the future. I've lived the British dream, and now I want as many people to have their British dream come true too. Someone has to grip this moment and make the right decisions. That's why I'm standing to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and your Prime Minister.
Those are, of course, the 8 Conservative leadership candidates who have passed the first threshold. Tom Tugendhat, Kemi Badenoch, Jeremy Hunt, Penny Mordaunt, Suella Braverman, Liz Truss, Nadhim Zahawi and Rishi Sunak. It has been a political rollercoaster of a day. Phones buzzing, charm offensives in overdrive. There's been no time to toast. The first hustings were held this evening. So what have the remaining contestants been saying? Let's get some insights now from